There are prisons, and then there was Brushy Mountain. Most prisons are designed to keep people behind bars. Brushy Mountain didn't need nearly as many bars. Nature did most of the work. Hidden deep in the mountains of eastern Tennessee, surrounded by steep ridges, thick forests, and miles of unforgiving wilderness, Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary was built in one of the most isolated places imaginable. Even if someone somehow managed to slip past the guards, climb the walls, and make it through the razor wire, they still had one problem. They were in the middle of nowhere. For more than 100 years, this prison became home to Tennessee's most dangerous criminals. Murderers, bank robbers, serial killers, and even the man who assassinated Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Violence was common, escape attempts were legendary, solitary confinement inside the hole was feared by every inmate, and the surrounding mountains became just as much a prison as the concrete walls themselves. Today, Brushy Mountain has become one of Tennessee's most fascinating places to visit. You can walk through the same cell blocks where notorious inmates spent decades, stand inside James Earl Ray's cell, and even see the infamous hole where prisoners disappeared for weeks, or sometimes months. So before this became one of America's most notorious prisons, it started with a problem Tennessee didn't know how to solve. And that story begins long before the first prison cell was ever built. In the late 1800s, Tennessee's coal industry was booming. Coal powered factories, heated homes, and fueled the railroads that connected the country. Mining companies needed thousands of workers, but paying miners decent wages was expensive. The state believed it had found a cheaper solution. Instead of hiring workers, Tennessee began leasing prisoners to private mining companies through what became known as the convict leasing system. On paper, it looked like a financial success. Companies paid the state for inmate labor while prisoners worked in dangerous coal mines for little more than food and a place to sleep. The reality was much darker. Many prisoners were forced underground for exhausting shifts in cramped tunnels filled with coal, dust, poor ventilation, collapsing roofs, and explosive methane gas. Injuries were common, deaths were simply considered part of doing business. To make matters worse, the companies now had access to labor that was far cheaper than hiring free miners. Local miners quickly realized what this meant. Why pay a hard-working miner when the state could lease prisoners instead? Tensions continued building until they finally exploded into one of Tennessee's most overlooked chapters of history. Beginning in 1891, free miners across eastern Tennessee took up arms against the convict leasing system. This conflict became known as the Coal Creek War. Groups of miners stormed prison stockades, freed prisoners, burned company property, and openly challenged the state government. For nearly a year, eastern Tennessee looked more like a battlefield than a mining community. The Tennessee National Guard was eventually called in to restore order. Although the miners ultimately lost the conflict militarily, public opinion had shifted dramatically. People began questioning whether the convict leasing system was ethical or even sustainable. But there was one major problem. The state still had hundreds of prisoners, many of whom had been mining coal for years. Officials came up with a new solution. If private companies couldn't use prison labor anymore, the state would simply run its own prison and coal mine. In 1896, construction began on what would eventually become Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary. The location wasn't chosen by accident. The prison sat directly beside rich coal deposits in Morgan County. Every day, inmates could be marched straight from their cells into the mines. Even more remarkable, many of the first prisoners actually helped build the prison itself. The massive stone walls rose slowly out of the mountains. Watchtowers overlooked every corner of the grounds, steel gates sealed off each section, cell blocks stretched out behind thick limestone walls and looked more like a medieval fortress than a prison. Unlike many prisons built on flat land, Brushy worked with the landscape instead of against it. Mountains formed natural barriers on nearly every side. The terrain itself became part of the security system. Some guards even joked that if an inmate somehow escaped the prison, the mountains usually caught him before they ever did. For decades, that turned out to be surprisingly true. By the early 1900s, Brushy Mountain had earned a reputation unlike any other prison in Tennessee. It wasn't where inmates started their sentences. It was where they ended up after causing trouble somewhere else. Violent offenders from other Tennessee prisons were routinely transferred here. If you assaulted another inmate, started riots, attacked guards, or became known as impossible to control, there's a good chance you'd eventually hear the words every Tennessee inmate dreaded. Pack your things, you're going to Brushy. The prison quickly became known as the end of the line. Not because every inmate stayed there forever, but because once you arrived, life usually became much harder. The work was harder, the punishments were harsher, the prison was more isolated, and many inmates realized they might never leave these mountains alive. Imagine waking up every morning in a concrete room barely larger than a walk-in closet, a thin metal bed bolted to the wall, a tiny sink, a toilet with almost no privacy, steel bars separating you from the narrow cell block, and in the distance the sound of iron doors slamming shut. That was everyday life at Brushy Mountain. The prison wasn't designed to be comfortable, it was designed to remind inmates every single day that freedom was gone. Most of the original cells measured only about 6 feet by 9 feet. That's smaller than many modern bathrooms. Many inmates shared those cramped spaces with another prisoner. 2 men, 2 beds, almost no room to move. In the summer, temperatures inside the stone prison could become unbearable. The thick walls trapped heat, and before air conditioning, the cell blocks often felt like ovens. In the winter, those same stone walls seemed to hold on to the cold. Smell was something many former inmates never forgot. A mixture of sweat, disinfectant, coal dust, and hundreds of men living in close quarters. Every morning began early. Long before sunrise, guards walked the tiers, making sure everyone was awake. For many decades, nearly every able-bodied inmate had a job. Some worked in the laundry, others repaired equipment, some cooked meals for hundreds of prisoners every day, and others maintained the prison grounds. But the hardest and most feared assignment was the coal mine. The mine entrance sat just outside the prison walls. Every workday, lines of inmates were marched from the prison toward the mountain. Armed guards watched every step. Once inside the mine, daylight disappeared almost immediately. The tunnels were dark, narrow, and hot. Many passages were barely tall enough to stand upright in. For hours, inmates chipped away at solid rock, loaded heavy carts with coal, and pushed them through winding tunnels. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Cave-ins were always a possibility. Poor air quality made the breathing difficult, and methane gas could build without warning. By the end of a shift, many prisoners looked almost unrecognizable beneath black dust. Some former inmates later described coughing up black mucus for years after leaving Brushy. Others developed long-term respiratory problems from working underground. In many ways, Brushy represented the state's replacement for the old convict leasing system. Instead of leasing prisoners to private companies, the state became the mining company. Let's talk about some of the significant areas in the prison. Cell Block D at Brushy Mountain was the maximum security unit reserved for the prison's most violent and dangerous inmates. Known as the end of the line, the unit provided isolated, private cells with severe restrictions. It was built to house the most violent prisoners who could not safely mix with the general population. It was actually positioned on the grounds where a previous death house once stood, right on top of it, actually. Historically used in tandem with the hole, prisoners kept in pitch black solitary confinement were sometimes brought to D Block temporarily to let their eyes adjust and regain vision before being sent back. We'll learn a little bit more about that when we get to the hole, about how they lost their sight because of how long they were in there and how dark it was. So these are actually their yards where they would get a little bit of fresh air, I guess. They're very small, not really a yard, more like a cell, but just outside. There was a 1-hour rotation where inmates housed in D Block's 32 single occupancy cells were under a 23-hour lockdown. They were escorted out individually, often in heavy restraints, to spend exactly 1 hour alone in these small cages to breathe fresh air before being locked back in their cells. Despite featuring triple locked doors and intense guard supervision, D Block gained a reputation within the Tennessee correction system as a site of perpetual violence and bloodshed. By 1989, the stabbing rates and extreme violence in D Block grew so uncontrollable that the state had to construct a brand new 96-bed high-security annex known as the Tombs. The visitation area utilized thick glass windows and cinder block partitions to completely separate visitors from maximum security inmates. Conversations took place across metal tables, historically requiring intercoms or raised voices through the glass barriers. This facility strictly controlled physical contact during visits for most inmates to prevent the intake of contraband or Then you have the guard station that directly overlooks the cafeteria. That window there points out to the cafeteria. The cafeteria at Brushy Mountain was widely considered the single most dangerous room in the entire prison. Feeding hundreds of violent maximum security inmates simultaneously created a violent environment. Mealtimes were highly coordinated but frequent flashpoints for lethal violence. Inmates had easy access to boiling liquids, heavy trays, and stolen kitchen utensils. In one of the room's most notorious incidents, an inmate was brutally beaten to death right on the cafeteria floor using a heavy wooden boat paddle. So you'll notice these beautiful paintings on the walls of the cafeteria. And it was basically to counteract the overwhelming bleakness and severe tension of the dining hall. They allowed the prisoners to clean the walls, sketch designs, and paint murals in an explicit attempt to boost morale and soften the hostile atmosphere. Ironically, instead of prison themes, the inmates painted peaceful scenes of the outside world, nature, large animal portraits, and historical depictions of the prison landscape itself. Much of the most prominent, beautiful artwork still visible on the cafeteria walls and columns today was painted by a highly talented incarcerated artist named Tim Cross, who later earned parole. So we'll head to cell block A and you will see a barber chair there. So incarcerated men were trained as barbers to shave fellow prisoners and guards. They were trusted with standard straight razors, making the shop a high security risk. A fun fact is, because haircuts were so inexpensive, guards sometimes brought their own friends and families into the facility to get their hair cut by the prisoners. The barbershop played a quiet but legendary role in the life of James Earl Ray, the assassin of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who served a 99-year sentence here. In the lead up to his infamous 1977 weekend breakout, Ray needed to trick guards during nighttime head counts. An inmate barber quickly swept up and smuggled real human hair from this very chair area over a period of weeks. Ray used the hair to construct a realistic dummy head. He tucked it into his bunk to buy himself a few extra hours of darkness before guards realized he had scaled the wall. Speaking of James Earl Ray, you can actually see his cell that he lived in most of the time he was here. James Earl Ray attempted to escape Brushy Mountain 4 times, with only 1 time being successful, and even that time he was only gone for the weekend until he got detained again. The dead drop, or death drop, represents one of the most brutal eras of inmate-on-inmate violence. The older castle-like concrete cell blocks featured narrow walkway tiers or catwalks extending up to 4 stories high. In the early to mid-1900s, these upper tiers lacked the heavy steel wire meshing, floor-to-ceiling bars, or safety netting seen in modern facilities. If an inmate or group of inmates wanted someone dead, they would orchestrate an ambush on the high walkways. The target would be grabbed, lifted, and hurled over the low railing, plummeting multiple stories straight down to the solid concrete floor. The fall almost always resulted in a broken neck, fractured skull, or instant death. Because it was done in the open but usually during blind spots and guard patrols, it was incredibly difficult for prison officials to prove who exactly pushed the victim. The culprits would simply blend back into the crowd of hundreds of inmates, leaving behind a dead drop. Tour guides often recount a specific blood feud where an inmate was targeted while walking back to his cell on the 3rd tier. He was blindsided by 3 men who didn't even use a weapon. They simply hoisted him by his legs and flipped him over the side. He died on impact on the concrete flats below while the attackers disappeared into the tiers. Guards frequently noted in logs that inmates fell from the upper tiers. However, the positioning of the bodies far away from the ledge lines almost always proved they were thrown with significant forward momentum rather than a simple trip or stumble. One horrific story from Brushy Mountain is how an inmate murdered his cellmate overnight, completely dismembered the body, and systematically flushed the pieces down the cell toilet. When guards conducted their morning head count and cell checks, the victim was completely missing from the cell. Upon closer inspection of the room, all that guards could find left of the man was a single bag of bones that wouldn't flush. If there was one place inside Brushy Mountain that every inmate feared, it wasn't the coal mine or the violent cell blocks, and it wasn't even the towering walls that surrounded the prison. It was a dark hallway hidden away from the rest of the prison, a place simply known as the Hole. The official name was solitary confinement, but no one called it that. At Brushy, everyone knew exactly what the Hole meant. It was where inmates disappeared after fighting, attacking guards, attempting escape, or breaking the prison's most serious rules. Sometimes they stayed for days, weeks, and occasionally months, and for some men, those weeks in isolation felt longer than years in general population. Unlike the regular cell blocks, the Hole was built to strip away almost everything. The cells were tiny, cold, bare, and concrete. Many former inmates later said that silence became one of the hardest parts because without conversation or activity or anything to stimulate you, hours blended into days, days blended into weeks. Some prisoners counted cracks in the walls, others memorized every inch of the cell. Some talked to themselves simply to hear another voice. You can still see the carvings in the wall where they chiseled tally marks and things like that just to keep up with how many days they had been in there. They could use a nail, a screw, maybe a piece of metal. I even read dental floss they could have used. So whatever they could get their hands on just to be able to carve into the walls. Of course, even the Hole couldn't stop every inmate from trying to escape. And one escape would become so famous that it captured headlines across the entire country. But one inmate would prove that even Brushy Mountain wasn't impossible to escape. His name was James Earl Ray. By the time Ray arrived at Brushy Mountain, he was already one of the most infamous prisoners in America. On April 4th, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. traveled to Memphis, Tennessee to support striking sanitation workers who were protesting unsafe working conditions and unequal pay. That evening, Dr. King was staying at the Lorraine Motel with members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Around 6:01 p.m., he stepped out onto the second-floor balcony outside room 306 to speak with friends below before heading to dinner. Just seconds later, a single rifle shot rang out. The bullet struck Dr. King in the face and neck, causing catastrophic injuries. Friends and aides rushed to his side while others pointed toward the boarding house across the street, where investigators later determined the shot had been fired. Dr. King was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, but despite doctors' efforts, he was pronounced dead at 7:05 p.m. He was just 39 years old. Police quickly recovered a bundle abandoned near the scene containing a Remington rifle, binoculars, and other items. Fingerprints on the rifle and several other objects were traced to James Earl Ray, a career criminal who had escaped from the Missouri State Penitentiary the year before. Ray fled the United States using false identities, traveling through Canada and across Europe. 2 months later, on June 8, 1968, he was arrested at London's Heathrow Airport while attempting to board a flight to Belgium with a forged Canadian passport. Ray later pleaded guilty to assassinating Dr. King and received a 99-year prison sentence. Just days later, he tried to withdraw his guilty plea, claiming he had been manipulated and insisting there was a larger conspiracy. He spent the rest of his life trying to overturn his conviction, but no court ever did. In 1977, he was transferred to Tennessee's Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary. For several years, everything appeared routine. He kept a relatively low profile. He worked his prison jobs, followed the daily schedule, and quietly gained the trust of those around him. But behind the scenes, he was planning. Ray wasn't working alone. Several inmates secretly began constructing an escape ladder. Not a small one, a ladder nearly 20 feet long. They built it piece by piece over many months. Wood was stolen from prison workshops, and pieces were hidden and assembled in secret, and somehow managed to avoid discovery despite countless inspections. On the night of June 10, 1977, the plan went into action. James Earl Ray and 6 other inmates carried the homemade ladder into the prison yard under the cover of darkness. One by one, the inmates climbed over, and for a brief moment, they had done what almost nobody believed was possible. They had escaped Brushy Mountain. News spread rapidly across the country, and the man convicted of killing Martin Luther King Jr. was on the run. State police responded immediately. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation joined the search, and the FBI also became involved. Helicopters searched the mountains from above, bloodhounds tracked scents from the forest, roadblocks appeared across eastern Tennessee, and hundreds of officers flooded the area. It became one of the largest manhunts the state had ever seen. But once again, the mountains began working against the escapees. Within days, members of the group were being captured one after another. James Earl Ray managed to stay hidden longer than most. For more than 50 hours, he evaded authorities in the dense wilderness surrounding the prison. When the Bloodhounds and search team finally located Ray at around 2 a.m. on June 13, 1977, he was completely by himself, exhausted, and muddy. Ray was returned to Brushy Mountain under even tighter security. His escape had lasted just over 2 days. Just a few years later, while studying in the law library at Brushy Mountain, Ray was ambushed and stabbed in the head, chest, neck, and arm 22 times by 3 inmates. He required 77 stitches during an hour of surgery. During the medical treatment following the stabbing, Ray received a blood transfusion. He contracted hepatitis C from the contaminated blood transfusion, which ultimately caused liver failure and kidney disease, leading to his death in 1998. One of the most serious incidents in Brushy Mountain's history occurred in 1982. That year, tensions inside the prison erupted into a hostage crisis. Several inmates overpowered correctional officers and took them hostage, demanding better conditions and changes inside the prison. For hours, no one knew how the situation would end. Negotiators worked desperately to keep everyone alive. Outside the walls, law enforcement officers surrounded the prison, while families waited anxiously for news. Inside, both guards and inmates understood that one wrong decision could turn the standoff into a massacre. Fortunately, after tense negotiations, the hostages were released alive. The crisis ended without the large-scale loss of life many had feared, but it exposed just how dangerous Brushy Mountain had become. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Brushy Mountain continued to face lawsuits over inmate living conditions, aging facilities, and the high cost of maintaining a prison that had originally opened in 1896. The massive stone walls were iconic, but they were also expensive to repair, and bringing the prison up to modern standards would have cost millions of dollars. By the late 2000s, state officials concluded that it simply didn't make financial sense to keep Brushy Mountain open. Newer prisons offered better security, more space, and lower operating costs. On June 11, 2009, the last inmates were transferred out, and after more than a century of housing some of Tennessee's most notorious criminals, including James Earl Ray, the prison officially closed its doors. Today, Brushy Mountain is no longer a maximum security prison. It's a museum that preserves the stories of the men who lived and worked behind these walls. As you walk through the prison, you'll find original inmate cells, the warden's office, solitary confinement, exhibits filled with authentic artifacts, and more. There are homemade inmate weapons, prison uniforms, photographs, artwork, tools used in the coal mines, and even memorabilia connected to some of Brushy's most famous inmates. While here, it's impossible not to think about everything these walls have witnessed. More than a century of violence, failed escapes, hard labor, riots, and unforgettable stories all unfolded right where visitors are walking today. If you're ever in East Tennessee, Brushy Mountain is absolutely worth the stop. It's one of the most fascinating prison museums in America, and you can still feel the history the moment you step inside. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, because every week we're exploring America's most incredible places, from breathtaking destinations to the dark history hidden beneath them. Thanks so much for watching, and see you on the next adventure.